historical budget review to the board. Thank you.
Thank you, President Duncan, also members of the board. Ms. Howley, I will ask Chief Accountability Officer, Dr. Jewel Harmon, to present this evening our historical budget review for Kent School District. Dr. Harmon, the floor is yours.
So, thank you, President Thangadaslam, members of the board, Dr. Watts, Ms. Howley. Our goal tonight is to do a historical budget review via BoardDocs, publicly available information, to kind of answer three questions. Questions that I've had myself and had to reconcile, but also questions from our public, and questions that are good for our staff to also understand and know. And those three questions are, kind of who was involved at different times in our budget planning process? What did we know? When did we know? And then as far as the dollars, where did they go? So those are the goals of this work. And we know that our budget cycle crosses multiple school years, the way that that fiscal process works. And so what this presentation is designed to do is to lay out that timeline. And we're going to go through various pieces of this. Some are district created, our budget development book. Others are state required, the F-195, which is the budget planning document and worksheet that the state requires. And our state audit reports. It's from our state auditor's office. And so that's what we're going to do, and we'll talk through those and answer those questions. Didn't realize that.
It's at the end.
Yeah, I get it. I was just like, oh, okay. There we go. So let's start with laying out a timeline that lays out when Dr. Watts started the work and how our budget planning happens and what our budget cycle is. So in 15-16, and planning for the 15-16 budget cycle, it is always budget season in the spring. Our 15-16 budget always starts with work sessions, covering programs, covering people and expenditures planned for an adopted budget come August. In May of 2015, Kent School District started that work with an interim superintendent, board of directors, and fiscal services staff at the time. In the first work session, they covered programs and departmental budget needs. And then they came together June 3rd to discuss people and other needs and to finalize the budget planning session. That's important to note because in addition to that, they discussed an interim contract of employment for Dr. Watts, because his contract starts officially with Kent School District July 1 of 2015, but they needed an interim between June 15th and June 30th of 2015. So that lays out a timeline I want you to hold in your heads. We're going to reference that a little bit. We'll come back to it. Right now, we're going to look at some budget documents as required by the state. This is representing fiscal year 2014-15. It's from the August 27th, 2014 board meeting, agenda item 4.01, exhibit A, page 7. It's the F-195 for 2014-15. It's a little bit intense, so we're going to talk about what it is first, and we'll explain all of this. So highlighted in your top left corner, fiscal year that we're referencing, 2014-15. Produced in August of 2014. Each year the F-195 is typically produced in August. And it is designed to represent a multi-year budget planning look. So what you get are, in column 1 are your most recent fiscal year's actuals, so 12-13 actuals. The budget year that you are currently living, so the 13-14 school year, the most recently completed year, and the fiscal year you're planning, 14-15, is what's represented. What I want you to pay attention to as we go through these are the pieces here. What's committed to our minimum fund balance policy, line 872, and line 890, our unassigned fund balance. So although this is about planning for 14-15, you can't help but start with our actuals of where we were living in 12-13. Overall, $30 million ending fund balance. Committed to the 5% minimum fund balance policy, $12.4 million. $6 million in unassigned fund balance, meaning that those were dollars available for spending for district needs. 13-14, an increase in the minimum fund balance policy due to an increase in the overall budget expenditures, 5%, and an unassigned fund balance of $3 million. As we plan 14-15, an increase in the minimum fund balance requirements, 5% of the previous year's budget, and an unassigned fund balance of $1.1 million. So as we look at 14-15 in our planning, we know that we started with $13 million for sure, that was our final actual, but we were living and planning already a reduction in our overall ending fund balance, but able to hold steady our commitments to our minimum fund balance policy. So let's fast forward a year, August of 2015. It is F-195 time again. August 26, 2015, board agenda item 4.01, Exhibit A, page 7, fiscal year 15-16. This time we're talking about fiscal year 15-16, report run approximately August of 2015. Same pattern, actuals of 2013-14, the budget for 14-15, planning for fiscal year 15-16. So a couple of things are different here. Remember I called out line 872 just a minute ago? This is a statewide change in the naming of row 872. This is not a district change. Every state fills out an F-195, every district fills out an F-195. The state changed the terminology here and the purpose of this line, not Kent School District. What now becomes important are lines 890 and 891. Again, unassigned fund balance, unassigned to minimum fund balance policy are still what we're monitoring. 13-14, that fund balance, $13.7 million, 3.5 in unassigned dollars that are able to be spent. 14-15, $15 million, 1.1. Now, as we move into the 15-16, this is where that change shows up. So it's not like we didn't lose the 15 million, it just moved to a different line. So that's the reminder here of what we're looking for moving forward. And 1 million. So previously we had that $30 million start. We knew that we were going to spend down 23 million, and we spent down, projected to spend down to the 19 million moving forward. Fast forward a year, next August, fiscal year 16-17, August 24th, 2016. Agenda item 4.01, Exhibit A, page 7 of the F-195. Fiscal year 16-17, the actuals ending for 14-15. Something interesting happens. And because this is referenced in BoardDocs, we are investigating our internal records and working with the state to figure out the reporting and why this is different here. There is nothing reported for economic stabilization, unassigned fund balance, or unassigned to minimum fund balance policy for actuals. 15-16, we believe we're going to be back at the 15 million, 1 million unassigned fund balance, 16-17 projection, nothing unassigned fund balance, 3.1 million assigned to the minimum fund balance policy. So in August of 2016, we were far away from where we thought we'd be with the 23 million we were going to end up with in our actuals. Still projecting 19 million for 15-16, down to 8 million overall in 16-17. So we got one more year. So fiscal year 17-18, August 23rd, 2017, agenda item 5.01, Exhibit A, page 7, F-195, 2017-18. Our actuals for 15-16 show up. And so remember we were projected to end at about $19 million overall. We're down to 3.8. Our unassigned fund balance, down to 99,000. Nothing present for unassigned to minimum fund balance policy. Date this was run, August of 2017. We're living 16-17, nothing in unassigned fund balance. We believe end with 3.1 million in our unassigned minimum fund balance policy, that 5%. Projections for 17-18, nothing, running in the negative for unassigned fund balance. Projecting still an overall ending fund balance in the positive. So that leads you to the question of, well, where did it go? That's what I wanted to know. So we go back in time to our budget planning process. Let's start with 14-15, when we saw that our budget shift was starting to happen with our spending. Fiscal year 14-15, August 13th, 2014, agenda item 2.01, special meeting budget work session. References pages 6, 14, 15 of that budget. Start with laying down a perspective. Governor Inslee directs state agencies to identify 15% cuts. Now, he was not directing school districts to cut 15%. He was laying the case that state funding is shifting, state funding is limited, and state agencies need to cut, recognizing that school district funding comes heavily from state dollars. Page 14 of that same budget book, Kent School District expands 68.5 FTE for good reason. Band, librarians, program expansions. They had an additional 8.6 FTE. They consider under superintendents and chiefs. And an additional 53 new positions due to enrollment and program increases. Clerical staff, assistant principals, support staff at central admin, operations. Still estimating a fund balance at that time, 15 million, 1.1, just like in the F-195, in the positive. Now we know the actuals for that year ended in a different place. But we move into our 15-16 budgeting. This time with 23.5 million in funding for the following new expenditures as listed. Keep in mind, what's most interesting is that at the bottom it talks about superintendent recommended new expenditures. Those are actually interim superintendent recommended new expenditures. Still projecting 15.26, 1.0 unassigned. Now, by all technicalities, this is Dr. Watt's budget. It is the budget he signed and adopted. His name is on the page of this, the first page of this, along with the board and cabinet at the time, executive cabinet at the time. This was also approximately 22 days into his time with Kent School District. So we move into budget season and planning 16-17. First budget development cycle with Dr. Watts, the helm. Still new funding expenditures. The COLA increases reduced, our obligatory salary step increases, 20 FTE for projected enrollment, APs for elementary, para support, curriculum adoptions, PSAT testing, expenditures. Administrative positions, 3. Recognizing that salary negotiations were also in progress. Unassigned, 3.1. Fund balance, overall still ending in 8.6. So that leads us to, well, who's watching us outside of KSD? Our Washington State Auditors every year come in and do an audit of the previous fiscal year. Let's go back to when we knew and when the auditors shared it with us. So, for the fiscal year ending August 31st, 2014, state auditors came in the following April of 2015, completed their report, and said at the end of that fiscal year, there was 6.3% overall represented for the general fund balance, more than the 5% needed for the minimum. Fast forward a year, April of 2016, the auditors come to look at the most recently completed fiscal year, 14-15 school year. Auditors said that at the end of the 14-15 fiscal year, the unassigned fund balance, $10.7 million, or 3.64% of the general fund expenditures. Fast forward one more year, April of 2017, auditing the 15-16 school year. Auditors say that at the end of the 15-16 school year, the unassigned fund balance is $99,000, or less than 1% of our general fund, well beyond. But the auditors pointed that out to us prior to. This was not new information. And so that leaves us here, where we are fiscally, but also it's budget season. So throughout this presentation, in addition to sharing the information, what I hope to convey is that there's a pattern, not just of previous behavior, but also of timeline of when things happen. So state reporting and planning due to the state in August, sharing out of state auditor reports in April, work sessions May, June, budget adoptions in August. And so as we think about this, the goal of this wasn't to talk about plans moving forward or where we are living right now, but to talk about how we got here. Because there seems to be a lot of question about where it was, what happened, where we spent, and why. And it shows that exactly what we intended happened. Not to overspend, not to be unsustainable, but to invest in people, programs, resources for the support of Kent School District. So I'm going to open the floor to questions to the board first, clarifying questions, other questions, before I open the floor to the public to ask questions. Keeping in mind that our goal and our needs require that we end this session at 6:15. I want us all to be mindful of that, but let's please, board.
So I just have some money. Let's narrow it down to two. Based on the information you're showing, why is the fund balance the important part of looking at the budget? Why aren't we looking at revenue minus expenditures and focusing on that from a balanced budget standpoint and not a fund balance standpoint?
So revenues minus expenditures are important in monitoring our kind of current spending. Now, it's important to budgeting as well, but important to monitoring the fund balance. So the fund balance is necessary in terms of the revenue and cash flow. So fund balance is typically used by school districts to cover in cash poor months. Granted, yes, if revenues and expenditures are balanced, we would always sustain and maintain our fund balance, and that is the goal. But a piece of this is also ensuring that that fund balance remains there for months when tax collections aren't there and other pieces. So even if we balanced a budget, it still would not ensure that dollars existed. I mean, even if it was balanced in that way, we still have to ensure that dollars exist there. And to watch right now is that the dollars do not exist, and they were diminishing, and we knew it, which meant that not only was our budget not balanced and we were overexpending our revenue, but we also weren't saving ourselves for our cash poor months when we needed to have that cash on hand. It's not that we're not doing that moving forward, and it's not an important strategy, it's just in this work. It's that was the telltale sign that our revenue and expenditures were out of balance.
I'll say I hear what you're saying, but I fundamentally disagree that every other organization I work with, including ones I've advised, balance is a calculation. It's not the important part. If you know, we saw 3 budgets up there, but for 3 of those budgets you were spending $6 million more than revenues, that was losing fund balance is just a function of math, and that the budget is about, granted, we don't control revenues for the majority.
We control expenditures.
Control, and so we control expenses to an extent. And so as I look at what I'm seeing, I'm not seeing what I would expect to see as a board member. Granted, I would confess that I'm seeing what I expect to see now, in a different way. So I guess it's how, because you were showing us like the state required reporting. I'd say, what else do you use besides the state required reporting when looking back in time at actuals and budget?
So when looking back in time, hindsight is 20/20. So every document you pick up, historical now, shows that path. Doesn't matter whether you're looking at expenditures and revenue, doesn't matter if you're looking at estimated fund balance, auditor reports, on and on. It is difficult to say the district's perspective on revenue versus expenditures or monitoring fund balance in the perspective. Because when I say we and when I say our, was not hearing that. I'm not saying that to make an excuse. It is saying it's difficult to say because some of the staff responsible for some of the decisions are not present to ask that.
Well, so also like, what would you think, the group here, what is the best thing to look at? If that form is generic, it's for every school district, we got to do it. That's one part of it. What else is an important tool for us to look at when we look at the next one?
So moving forward, revenues and expenditures are critical for us, and that is what we're monitoring moving forward. So we always have to spend less than we bring in, recognizing that. Now, I would say that some of our expenditures are controlled cost, and we become better at forecasting that, estimating that, building in real and legitimate contingencies, and looking at anomalies. Trying to figure out, are they truly anomalies? What's driving that? What's the root cause of that? And then how do you build that into a forecast? It's difficult to build an anomaly into a forecast model, but how do you do that and how do you account for that? And then how do we clean up processes that allow for anomalies to show up? So, but it is definitely expenditures versus revenues and planning for that in advance.
I think I guess I have one more question. Because you're looking like, when we're looking, we saw current year, prior year actuals, next year budget. Do you think that that's enough years, or are you planning more on a 3-4 year ahead advance cycle?
Oh, so
what do you think is what's your recommendation?
So make no mistake, we have talked now about 3 to 5 years out. Knowing that it gets sketchier the further past 3 you go, because all kinds of ifs move into that model. If state legislation changes, if there are other levy pieces or perspectives on levy that change. All of those things start to move. What enrollment looks like and growth looks like between that 3 and 5 depends on what the city plan is, and all of those things start to become a little iffier, but definitely the next 3 years and building that plan. And so we are, I won't say the district has ever absolutely budgeted single year, but we are definitely looking more at a 3-year budget. So the decisions we're making in this fiscal planning year, how do they very really impact not just 18-19, 19-20, and 20-21? So yes, no, we're not just living because the state requires us to only put out a plan for the next year based on the most recent 2 years. We're thinking about what that looks like moving forward beyond the next year. So other...
I'm glad to hear you're doing that. We've been asking for that for a long time, of being able to see what the impacts are on different things. So as we look at what was explained here, I know that there's other pieces, right, that came in. Like there were levy monies that came in that was when we reinstated different positions and things. So as we look at this and plan for forward, how are we taking some of the lessons learned from as we're reinstating or looking at programs? So
sustainability is a big piece of this. So that's why that's part of that kind of from 1 to 3 year look, and not just the 3 to 5 year gap of sustainability, and what that growth looks like. So again, building in real inflation costs for things, thinking about what that looks like, thinking about student enrollment and being really conservative in our projected enrollment estimates. And it would seem counterintuitive to be conservative in your enrollment projections, but if you do that, then it ensures that you're estimating your spending based on a very tight and limited enrollment. And it also reduces the likelihood of over expenditure because you're not assuming that additional revenue is coming in because of enrollment, because that also drives some of that. But in addition to the program piece, it really is thinking about then programs that are necessary, how that is impacted. And it's, although levy dollars are supportive for that, it is difficult to say what piece is basic ed funded versus levy dollar funded. It is not a clean divide, because some of them ask, well, can you say what's covered by the levy versus what isn't? Well, there are portions of everything that we do that are levy supported and that are basic ed or general fund kind of supported in that way. So.
One follow on that, especially when you talk about enrollment, because over the years we've heard these are conservative numbers. And so how do we as a board know that they truly are conservative numbers?
So we could work to communicate that better in our budget updates monthly, but we talk a little bit about where we are with enrollments and kind of what that trend looks like and whether or not we're on pace with what we typically see. I think one of the reasons historically why we've seen big dips in our enrollment in the spring and some of that change is real. But some of it is also because those bodies never appeared. And so that means that we weren't as conservative and weren't as tight with our enrollment projections. And so I think some of that evidence is, are we holding steady? So if your projections on anything are good, the numbers don't wiggle a whole lot. If your projections are bad, then you've got a lot of gap in that, either over or under. And in budgeting and accounting, it's just as, well, in this particular instance, it is not just as bad to be over as it is to be under, but in typical accounting practice, you don't want any overages or unders. You want very tight.
So thinking about this over those budgets, so I'm assuming these numbers are presented every year.
Mm-hmm.
So then who would have been, or who should have been asking questions when we saw these numbers going in this direction? Who should have been asking questions, or who would have been?
Everybody. So this is not something where I would say this person didn't ask this person is solely responsible for not asking the questions for this. No, or this position or this role. So I would say this even. So I'll say not having been a part of all of these, but yeah, looking back, I should have. If I asked the question about this here and known, well, hey, okay, in a state audit exit, what do we do next? Or what is our next practice for this? When we do our budget planning, okay, so do we need to pull back and revise our budget, even though we've adopted it? What do we need to bring to our board? So there are at all places. So there are I would say any member of executive cabinet, any board member, any finance staff member, any public person who saw any of these and said, hey, I see something odd, or I want to ask a question. There are opportunities at every point for those who are district staff or community stakeholders to ask that, and should have. And moving forward, this has been eye-opening for me in terms of, okay, your role is to speak up. So clearly here, even though it's an autopsy in history and wasn't a part of this, the lesson learned for me is that, yeah, there's always a voice, and there's always an opportunity to share news that's not always good news. So
I have another question. So thinking about this and thinking about some of the contracts that were entered, was there an opportunity to eliminate some of those contracts or make changes to those contracts once we saw, for example, the enrollment projections? So once we saw that was less than what we had staffed for, was there opportunity to eliminate some positions or to make changes during that year to help save some of the money when we found out that obviously we're in a situation where we probably could have stopped the bleeding a little bit ahead of time?
So yes and no. So there are labor partner contracts that sometimes prohibit that, or that we have to work in conjunction with, that determine all of those pieces. But that doesn't mean that it's absolutely forbidden. It just makes it not as simple as saying, okay, you need to change your staffing, whether it is classroom-based staffing, district-based staffing. There are labor partners, and that requires sometimes a conversation at the table that's very formal, and it still may not end up with us doing that. Even with some of our vendor contracts, so as we move forward in this, in the spring of 17, when we first noticed some things and we started doing MSOC cuts at central admin and pushed people back through IVT back into the classrooms and investigate our vendor contracts. Sometimes it is just as expensive to break the vendor contract, or more expensive, in the middle of a year or middle of a season than to keep the current contract. So yes, there are always opportunities to explore that and do some of that, but also balancing the cost of, and then really staying on top of when are those key timelines to do that in an appropriate way when dealing with people and cost for vendor or product. So yes, it's possible, but not always easy or simple.
general-based budgeting and cost center budgeting, but it's really important that if there are contracts that we need to break or that we need to continue to pay but not use, I think we need to bring that to the attention of the public, because I think the concern has been ongoing concern. We have all of these products that we're not using, but we're spending money on it. We continually spend money. I still don't know how many schools are really using Naviance, for example. And so, how do we, as you present this information, I think for us as a board and the public, I think we really need to see not where the money's going in terms of program summary, but in more drill down fashion, so that we can see these programs are making money or losing money. And I know it's a difficult thing, but from what Ross mentioned at the legislative update last board meeting, I think that's going to be the requirement of the legislature moving forward, right? The local money and breaking it down by...
So we've actually talked about some ways to, and learning from some neighboring school districts of how they're displaying some of that and allowing, or making it available for people to kind of, when I say choose their own adventure, I mean like when they are ready to investigate and dig into the budget, being able to, through either drop down or other graphics or pieces, choose which pieces of the budget they want to delve into and how they can do that. We have to work with the board or public or even internally to decide what metric we're going to put out to talk about that. So is it the number of logins? Is it the number of page visit? Like what for certain products, what is that piece? Is it the number of registrants? So when you use Naviance, for example, every high schooler uses it for their high school and beyond plan. But are you looking for that? So what then is the metric of success or determiner that we measure that is consistent as a theme to be able to say this is it? And it's not an impossible thing to do. It's just we've got to figure out what that is so that we can say, here's the metric we're using for these types of things and here's where it is, good or bad, and just figuring that out.
One comment that resonates throughout each one of the questions, I believe, has to do with a very simple and now always easy process. So how do we make sure that we are planning, developing, implementing, and ultimately evaluating our budget? And we can do that because we have a strategic plan, a blueprint. Blueprint does one thing really well. It defines our priorities. 4 goals: focusing on student success, two-way meaningful communication, organizational effectiveness, and a diverse premier workforce. That implies that our choices
Should be aligned with.
Our programs, our processes, our people should be aligned to our strategic plan so that when we are evaluating how well, and I think President Vegadossi, your question has to do with what we've talked about often, which is return on investment. How do we know that what we're investing is actually paying dividends based on our core business of teaching and learning? Now, there are metrics that we currently use in our strategic plan, and once we're more intentional, I would say continue to be as intentional as we need to be, and even more so for programs like Naviance or any other program or service that we implement. That's our goal. That's one of our ongoing priorities, and that will help us toward that.
I do want to clarify that I think we need to make a differentiation between efficiency and effectiveness. And so if we're looking at, does it align with the blueprint? We're talking about effectiveness to some degree, but efficiency is it something that we're continuing to use, and what is the opportunity cost of letting this thing go? That sort of analysis where we're not continually bleeding, from the investments we've made. So I think that's a 2-part analysis on, how do we move forward more efficiently and effectively.
I'm just getting back to enrollment. We have the 5-year facility plan where it's looked at where the possible housing developments are going to be being placed. And are we following up on that? Do we follow up on that yearly to see how those developments are coming along? And I know there's a formula for the cost of the house, how
elementary students you're gonna get and how many secondary students you're gonna get?
So we do, and we've also talked about, what other softwares are out there, what other districts are using. We used to partner with the City of Kent. They offered us a service for one of their tools to use free of charge, and they moved into wanting to charge us. The license significantly increased, the cost of it increased from the vendor. And so they wanted to share that cost with us. And we came back to the table and we're investigating, is that still the best route to go? So does this tool really meet all of our needs and some of those things, or should we go with another tool? Are we reaping the full benefits? Because we went from using it kind of free of charge to then having to split the cost 50-50. And so it really brings up the, where do we invest? How do we invest? What are we getting on that? So yes, we're still monitoring some of that, but we're also looking at tools that may help us with that. And then still monitoring other things like the census data trends, American Community Survey trends that also talk about projections of some of those things as well. So local and kind of federal monitoring of that, so. So we've got about 10 minutes for the public. The podium is open. This is a question period related to budget. I would like to keep it to historical. There'll be some opportunities to hear more about our current fiscal standing for the month and those kind of things later, so I'm not going to pull up projections for that or talk about that as much. I'd like to keep the dialogue, though not formally timed, to about 3 minutes to give others opportunity if there's there.
Thank you. I'm Cindy Prescott. I'm currently retired from Kent School District as a teacher, working as a substitute and a prior KDA president. Jewel had a question for clarification purposes. Were you saying that the school district knew about what was happening with the budget, that things were going down and our fund balance was getting lower before KDA came to talk to Dr. Watts in March of 2016? Are you saying you already knew about it? It sounded like you were saying that the district was already fully aware of that. I wanted to clarify.
So I'm not saying fully aware. What I'm saying is that there's F-196 documents on BoardDocs that say that there were projections that were not lining up with our actuals. So I don't know if the spring of 2016, I have to go back and exactly look. So if you reference, what date?
Well, March 16 was when KEA and WA were talking to the district about an erroneous fiscal statement for the month of March 2016.
So from an audit perspective, I would say no, because it was for the 14-15 school year in 2016. In terms of official notification, their F-196 in 2015 was saying this, and not giving that indication of planning and budgeting. For 2016, still holding at 15 million. So although there's a pattern of spend down, it's not saying that it's not meeting the fund balance at that time. So I don't know what was there, but the documents don't say that there was knowledge on Dr. Watts' part of that. So I don't know for sure, for certain, what was shared with him. I wasn't the person responsible for sharing that information, so I don't know, but I'm not saying yes or no. What I'm saying is, based on this is August of 2016. August of 2015 still puts the district in a financial position that is different from what you're saying was shared, so I don't know.
Well, I'm sure that our current KPA president can talk more to that, but I know for a fact that there was a board meeting, an emergency board meeting called right after that information was shared from KEA and WA to the district, where the board was then informed that there was a mistake, that we were actually in the red in March of 2016. So I just wanted to clarify, because it sounded to me, I may have misunderstood you, but it sounded to me like you said that the district had been aware that this was going on for a while.
So it's a clear pattern of spending. The overspending was a pattern that they were aware of.
They were aware that there was overspending going on prior to that?
It's evidence from year to year that you're spending down your fund balance, and so you're overspending.
Okay, so there was awareness of that. And then when KEA came to talk to Dr. Watts at that point and to Ralph Fortunato, and we saw that we were actually in the red, our school district was in the red. Right at that point, alarm bells, and I'm just wondering, it seems like slow action. So that's commentary, but I know that Ms. Padilla
has a question?
has something she wants to talk about, so I'll let her go.
Christy current KSD president. I noticed that you had Governor Inslee, a slide on him, and it talked about the 15% reduction in state agencies. So can you explain to me how that affected the Kent School District?
So it actually didn't impact the Kent School District. So what you see is that they actually, even though there could have been a reduction in state funding looming, the district actually continued to expand programs and continued to richly staff and provide resources and expand programs. So if you take a look at here, so instructional FTE, operational FTE, executive administrative FTE, clerical support FTE, all good things, all expansions of programs, services, and all of that. But that doesn't speak to the previous.
Right, so the association fully recognizes that there's money, there was a significant increase on people during that time. So I'm wondering why that was, the statement about Governor Inslee was included, because from 2015 to 2017, the state revenue increased by $60 million as McCleary was being put in effect. The last piece was salary, and we're not going to talk about this year, but they were starting to fund class size, MSOC, other basic ed. So there was an actual increase of revenue during that time, not a 15% cut.
So as they're planning 14-15, they're talking about what they believe is forecasting for 15 to 17. It didn't come to fruition in that way. But quite possibly, hindsight being 2020, the correct action probably should have been to not expand programs and services and to save, because we didn't know what was going to happen. So what we did was we made the investment prior to the funding being available. So when the increase in funding came, the next best strategy should have also been to not necessarily expand because there's increased funding, but consider the sustainability of the previously made investments prior to the dollars being available. And so what the district did was, as new dollars became available, continued to put those dollars and resources to work for the school district. Makes sense. However, they'd already committed dollars that didn't exist before that. And so it's the consideration and balance of, as new dollars come in, was it enough to meet your previous need? And if it wasn't, then maybe those dollars should have been spent that way. Or do you have extra dollars that are new dollars to make new investments, or should these dollars be spent to actually sustain the previous investments? So we had small class sizes because they were, for lots of reasons, prior to when the state started funding that and making that investment in a different way. And so we maybe should have considered how we did that differently looking backwards. It's always clearer to see. And so, yes, the funding model changed, but we were making those investments before it was funded. And we didn't have a recovery plan for saving those dollars.
Right, so I guess I just wanted to make clear, because there were questions asked to me, that there weren't any cuts to our school district. There was actual additional funding put into our district, maybe not to the degree where we were funding people.
Or programs. It's not even just people. It is, we invested in all kinds of things that were good at the time and made perfect sense, but weren't sustainable.
Right. One last clarifying question, because I've seen so much on social media about these huge raises that our teachers have received in the last few years. You mentioned at 1.8 COLA. Can you explain what a COLA is? Because I think that people think it's a raise, and actually it's a pass-through from the state that was funded by the state, and I'm not quite sure.
So,
because it's being used as a raise.
So to be clear, it is not just, so first of all, a COLA is a cost of living adjustment. They are made available to employees to cover the cost of inflation and things that change over their prior year's work. They are not just afforded to labor partners exclusively. So this is not just a KEA burden or a Teamster burden or a KOP burden or any of those. It is any staff member. And it is because inflation comes, and as other expenses, they recognize that the salary needs to adjust for that. Does it increase any staff member's pay? So would a COLA increase my pay? Yes. So by technical definition, is it a raise or increase in salary? Yes. It is not a raise in the way that people think about it, meaning you are given just an increase of $10,000 in your salary. No, it is intended to address inflation. And so in 1 year, 3%, and the next year it's 1.8. But that is also reflective of the state in terms of their thinking about what they think inflationary costs are, what they can afford to give. And so I hope that clarifies.
So right, it's a, I was just gonna say, it's a pass-through from the state, so it didn't cost the district. It's a pass-through.
Oh, no. So it's not, so I'm not saying that it's an additional district expense. What I'm saying is, yes, they fund the COLA or the cost of living adjustment. And then that is on top of all other expenses. So when we had additional staff in the prior year, we're not thinking about all of those other add-ons. So we've said before that the cost of any staff member is always exponential. It's never just could you afford it in the single year. It is can you afford the exponential and sustainable cost of that employee. Increases in cost of living adjustments, increases in benefits expenses, all of those things become exponential with just having the money in a single year to add a staff member, any staff member.
But again,
and they don't necessarily cover all of that.
Because we don't give additional money for health care. I mean, I get the same.
Right, but the state doesn't necessarily say, here's all that you can give for this. The district also makes some decisions to give more than that at certain times.
But
or
not for teachers. The information is this for teachers, not for teachers.
So this isn't saying that it's just teachers. Okay. Nothing that I've shared has said anything that was KEA or teacher specific. Okay. And so being present in this conversation the entire time, I can say that I never pointed the blame with any labor group or said that any group was responsible. So I just want to be clear on that. And that's never been my goal, Christy, and that's never been the intent of this. And that's not what I was saying. And I tried to make clear in each of these, all of the programs that were expanded and all the labor partners that benefited from this. And the district as a whole, I've never said that they were not the right thing to do in terms of expanding programs and resources and support. It just wasn't financially sustainable. That's what this says. And it's any of these. It's pick a year right now. And it's because hindsight is partially 2020. I also want to recognize and be respectful that the board also has an executive session and it's 6:17. I'll turn the floor back over to the board of directors. Director DeBruler.
I'd like to just ask a question, clarifying question, and it's not wanting to blame anything.
No.
But the prototypical school, the legislature says, this is how many teachers you should have, this is how many nurses, all of that. We were spending levy dollars for 130 some extra people, and didn't we have to pay the COLA out of the levy money?
Absolutely. So any staff out of formula that we take on, for any type of staff member that we take on, the district is responsible for all costs associated with that. Cost of living, benefits, salaries, all of that. Step increases. Even if they're contractual, the district bears that burden in its entirety.
Okay, thank you. I wanted to get that out there too.
So the floor is you all, because you have next steps.
Thank you, Dr. And we will recess for an executive session for approximately 45 minutes to discuss complaints against an employee and or review the performance of a public employee.